Good evening all, and welcome. As the year comes to an end, I have prepared a special video. Throughout the year I work with a number of different creators, who I will sometimes narrate stories for. Some of these stories are absolutely fantastic, and simply can't be missed, and I really would like to share my favorites throughout the year with you today, while working with others. I'm fairly certain most of you will not have heard the vast majority of these, but props to anyone who has, although I seriously doubt it. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. The other day I ran into a former university friend in Shinjuku. He said he was about to head into Shibuya to do a little shopping. We always hung out and helped one another at university, so I was really happy to see him, and I invited him to have coffee with me in the station. It was great. We were talking about old times and laughing loads. It was such a great chance meeting, and a real pick-me-up to the bad week I'd been having. Amidst the jokes and nostalgia, my friend Ash paused and looked out of the window and said, "Don't you ever feel scared?" "Scared?" I asked. On average in Japan, there are 1,000 murder cases each year. The current population of Japan sitting at 1.2 million. Therefore, for every 100,000 citizens there are, one of them must be a murderer. By this logic, we can safely assume that there could be 7 murders in this station each day. I wonder how many we have brushed shoulders with today. How many we sat next to, how many stared our way, studying us with their eyes. I was taken aback. This wasn't exactly fitting with our conversation. I had to take a moment to do the mental maths in my head, while also trying to figure out the reason for this gear change. Trying to keep the conversation light, I replied, "Ha, don't worry about it. If you consider that some of those 1,000 killers a year are arrested, and some are so far away they probably wouldn't even be 500 miles from the station. I'm sure there aren't 7 murderers here now." "Yeah, but I'm sure there's one here now." With that reply, he looked directly at me. His cold eyes focused on mine. They were unmoving. I gasped. Was he trying to tell me something? Was he trying to tell me that he was one of those 7 murderers he hypothesized? I remember, to thinking back, something had happened when we were at school together. We weren't friends until university, but I did know him from school. You see, there was a park on a really tall hill near our school. It was such a pain to climb up, but us kids loved going there after school. I remember there were rumors that Ash had a girlfriend he had gotten pregnant. A friend of ours told me that Ash was worried by the responsibilities of having a child at such a young age. So he did something. Maybe it wasn't a conscious choice. Maybe it wasn't even intentional. Maybe it didn't even happen this way. But rumor has it, Ash pushed her down those steps leading into the park. The fact is, a girl from our school fell down 50 stone steps and struck her head multiple times. Another fact is that the park incident was dealt with as an accident by the authorities. The final fact was that there were only 2 people in that park, no witnesses, and no further questions were asked. As this memory or rumor flashed back to me, I started to feel quite sick. "It's about time I was heading off," I said. "Well, let's head off together," he replied. We left the cafe and headed back towards the station. Even after rush hour, Shinjuku Station is always so busy. As we walked and weaved through the massive commuters, and if Ash was to be believed, the would-be killer spoke. Going back to our chat earlier in the cafe, one interesting theory to consider is that 1 in 25 psychopaths are capable of committing crimes that they will get away with. They elude their punishment, you see. If we were to put into theory with the maths I explained earlier, perhaps as many as 7,000 people capable of murder pass through this station each day. I laughed at this and said, I guess the streets are filled with the would-be serial killers then. This station must be a real danger zone. Well, perhaps. You happen to pass one by on the street here today. Then, this is my train. See you, Ash said, and as I turned to say goodbye properly, he had already disappeared into the bustling crowd of people. I thought he was heading for Shinjuku. I guess he changed his mind. I ran up the stairs to catch my train as it was pulling in. I was in a crowd racing for the train, as I heard the music playing to indicate the departure was imminent. I would make it though. I was now at the top of the stone stairs of the station. I felt an arm around my neck, gripped tight, and a familiar voice mutter into my ear. I can still remember the faint smell of coffee and Ash's hot breath in my ear. I told you to be careful. I told you there was a killer in the station today. Shortly after this, I felt a hard, painful shove in my sternum, and after that I have a brief memory of falling backwards, skittering through the crowd down the steps. Faces looked shocked, but one smiling as I fell. Ash. I never want to see him again. In 2001, my grandpa, who I always referred to as Pop-Pop, was diagnosed with prostate cancer. I don't know the details, but I remember thinking it wasn't too bad because my family downplayed the whole thing constantly. I had never suffered a death in the family. I'd never even seen a dying person before, so I had no way to judge how Pop-Pop was actually doing. So I accepted my dad's insistence that his father was doing just fine. Eventually, the doctors told my family to take Pop-Pop home. My parents assured me it was because he was getting better. Obviously, my dad would be at my grandma and Pop's house every morning to help out however he could. And every morning, after he had done everything he could for them, he would return home and ask if my sister and I would want to go see them. We'd obviously say yes, so he'd hop back into the car and take us back out to their house. One day, I remember having a really strange dream. It was cowboys and Indians. I've never been interested in westerns at all, but my Pop-Up loved them. Suddenly, my Pop-Up appeared in my dream. Well, not in my dream, more like in front of it. He mouthed something inaudible, and I woke up. I looked at the clock. It was around 7:30. Way too early for a 13-year-old boy to be up, but the dream had shaken me, so I crawled out of bed. My sister was already up, which was equally strange, so I said my good mornings and grabbed some cereal. Around noon, my dad comes home, and as usual, he asks if we want to go see Grandma and Pop-Pop. By this point, he knows he doesn't need to ask, but habits are hard to break. We load up the car and head over, and here is where everyone feigns surprise out of politeness. Before my dad turns off the car, he tells us, "Guys, I have some news for you. Pop-Pop died this morning." I was stunned, for many reasons. Obviously, first, I thought he was getting better, and second, because I recalled my dream and realized what it was my Pop-Up was saying. He was mouthing goodbye. I later realized he died around 7:30 that morning, the same time he appeared in my dream. Furthermore, my dad would always bring our dog with him to my grandparents' house, a little Jack Russell called Lucky. Lucky would always hide under the hospital bed my Pop-Up was in. The day my Pop-Up died, Lucky skulked out from under the bed, and as he took his last breath, Lucky looked off to the far side of the room and let out a chilling howl. Not all that terribly fascinating, but I suppose the true stories rarely are. This happened a few years ago when I was working late at the lab. I was studying engineering back then, and I was writing my graduation thesis. I had so much to do, I was pretty much in the lab every night working long into the early hours of the morning. My thesis deadline was approaching, and I was racing the finish line, to be honest. I was writing my thesis between experiments. I honestly shouldn't have been wasting time earlier in the year. I finally wrote the outline for the thesis the day before the deadline, which only left a final confirmation experiment for me to do. The good thing was that in a sense time was on my side. Each experiment took a long time to conduct, a few hours before each reaction, so I could write my thesis while waiting. And because I had left it so late, it meant I would be pulling an all-nighter in the lab again. It appeared that I was the only one who had left it so last minute, so I was alone in the lab and the only person in the whole building. As you might expect, it was pretty lonely there. I turned on the lights on to make it seem less lonely, and I even turned on the lights to the corridor, just as a warning to anyone. What I did was dumb. Conducting experiments alone at night with no support is very dumb and dangerous, and I certainly should not have done that. I think the following happened around 3 a.m. At this point, my experiment was finally reaching its conclusion. I was making my checks. I didn't want any mistakes to undo all this good work, and I didn't have time to do it over. I was simultaneously checking my arguments in the thesis too. Pleased there wasn't any glaring errors, and just a few minor things to correct. I could now see the finish line. I looked up from my work and saw a stranger standing at the entrance of the lab staring at me. I thought I knew everyone who worked or studied in this department, but I didn't recognize him. It was strange to see someone this late, let alone someone I'd never met. Our eyes met, and I thought to myself, this is bad. Something about this situation was very off-putting. It was past 3 a.m., and a man was just staring at me while I was all alone in the lab. I looked away, and when I looked back, the man was gone. Before I knew it, I was waking up at around 6 a.m., completely disoriented and confused. I must have dozed off. Now it was 6 a.m. It was a bit bright in the lab. The morning light was spilling in from the windows, and I scrambled to finish my thesis. I was suffering from lack of sleep, and I was all over the place. I couldn't shake the thought that the strange man could have been watching me while I slept. He was a total stranger. I was determined to ask someone about him after I was finished writing. I remembered that he was wearing a blue vertical striped shirt. The more I thought about the guy, the creepier it got for me, since I was the last one in the lab, and I had the only key. We had to check out the key and sign a book to show who was last in the lab and who had the key. I couldn't think of a logical reason as to how he appeared. As an engineer, a problem without a solvable solution tends to agitate me. This is worse. This was unexplainable. By 8 a.m., another student arrived at the lab. I told him about the man that I'd seen, and he said he may have entered through some unlocked door elsewhere in the building. I wasn't very satisfied with that answer, so I spoke to a senior lab technician. He chuckled and offered a similar explanation, but I pushed back. That was when he said something quite strange. He said there was an incident in the building where a young man took his life and joked that perhaps I had seen a ghost. I brushed this off as nothing but superstition. You know, a ghost story? Personally, I thought better of someone who had spent their life devoted to the application of logic. But to entertain my own curiosity, I researched our lab's history and found that a part of the story was true. There was a broken-hearted lover who saw no sense in carrying on and ended his life right there in the lab. I read on and came to an interview with a former student who discovered his body. I don't want to disrespect the departed, but I feel it adds context to the story. According to the former student, he was wearing the shirt he took his girlfriend out for the first time in. I felt chills race up my spine when his friend described the shirt he was wearing on the fateful night. A blue, vertical striped shirt. Now that I've had time to reflect on the incident, I somehow don't feel scared. I second-guess what I saw often. I don't know if what I had seen was brought on by my tiredness, or if I really did experience something paranormal. But it all feels like a dream to me. Maybe I'd heard a rumor, and in my tiredness and stress, I created the image of the figure watching me. I find some comfort in believing this. However, it doesn't explain how I knew the color on his shirt. It remains, to me at least, an unsolved mystery. This happened when I was younger, right before I became a teenager. It was when we all found out that my uncle was having an affair. The adults all thought I was too young to understand, but I knew. That's terrible, right? Well, it gets worse. Things between him and his mistress went south, and we were confronted with the aftermath. Apparently, this wasn't his first affair. By the way, my uncle is my mother's sister's husband. Naturally, the family was so angry at him, we all loved my auntie. We held a kind of kangaroo court at their house. They lived way out in the sticks, in a really quiet and rural neighborhood. My role in this grubby situation was to make sure their kids, both in elementary school, didn't hear a word. I was to take them far away from the arena of conflict and just keep them occupied while the grown-ups talked it out. Fortunately, they had a massive house. We shut ourselves in another part of it, a kind of summer house, and played some games. It wouldn't have been that nice for them to hear the fallout. The kangaroo court didn't start until the afternoon and went long into the night. And now that I believe I have adequately set the scene, let me tell you what happened next. My cousins needed to go to bed. I tucked them in to make sure they were all right. I think it was around midnight at this point, and I got into bed myself. I awoke sometime later in the dead of night. I was thirsty, and I headed to the kitchen. On my way there, I thought I heard another noise, that someone else was awake. I hoped it was one of my parents. I couldn't see anyone out there, so I grabbed a canned drink and headed back to the room. But just as I was about to leave, I heard that noise again. I managed to locate the area the sound was coming from, the front door. They had a sliding door just in front of the main entrance, and I noticed that it was a crack open. I stopped dead in my tracks. I knew the door was shut only moments ago. I was sure of it, so the noise I heard must have been the screen door sliding open. Despite the unease I felt in the pit of my stomach, I wanted that door shut, so I crept over to approach it with the intention to close it. Then I saw something. I saw a black glove hand creep around the frame of the door, and that is when I felt my spine turn to ice. Soon after the hand, a black shoe shot through the gap at the base of the door. The owner of that shoe edged the sliding door further open to a gap of around 15 centimeters, and I slowly and fearfully looked up and met the shadow of an intruder. A woman was peering around the edge of the door. When her eyes met mine, I felt her glare. I froze in my tracks. My limbs felt completely stiff. When I saw her put her hand against the door and begin pushing it further open. This caused me to break out in goosebumps. I couldn't believe how brazen she was, entering the house right before me. I had to do something. My fight or flight kicked in. I thought that if I didn't do something, there would be consequences, potentially fatal ones. I was very lucky to be holding a can of drink. I hurled it as hard as I could at her in the eyes. Terrifyingly, when it connected, she didn't make a sound. I expected her to scream with the force that I put into the throw, but she just silently backed out the door. Before I realized what I was doing, I had locked the door, as I heard a chilling gasp from behind the door, and then silence. Knowing the other members of the family were on the other side of the house, the only way to get to them would be to go outside, as my uncle's house was really big. I slept by the doors to protect my cousins. The next morning I was awoken to the sound of my mother screaming. I opened the door, and sticking out of the screen doors were a pair of plier-like tools. There was some weird liquid on the locks too. My cousins woke up and were visibly shaken. Mum asked me what happened and I gave her a rundown of the events. I soon discovered the would-be home invader was none other than my uncle's mistress. Though I was praised for my defense of my cousins, the incident rocked me, and I kind of hate my uncle for putting us through this situation. This happened around 3 years ago, when I started living alone. I moved into a really nice place. It was a corner apartment on the top floor. I loved it. My balcony was south-facing, and the windows were huge, which made for some awesome views. There was one issue though. The partition between my balcony and next door's. It wasn't very high or wide. There were big gaps between the walls and the partition as well. I could see into next door's balcony, and I guess they'd be able to do the same. Also, it didn't look that safe. Anyone could just break it down or climb it. I guess that the partition had to be like that in case of an emergency. I didn't like it all that much though. The rent was cheap, and the building was old, so I didn't care. Typical for a single man, I suppose. Now, I love all things scary, and I have a vivid imagination, so I would creep myself out imagining someone staring at me through the gaps. I didn't know why my mind did that. It never happened, by the way. The only time I'd ever seen the neighbor was an awkward interaction when we were doing our laundry at the communal laundry machines at the same time. One night, I came back from a night out drinking with my work colleagues and it was quite late. I was really tired and wanted to do nothing but sleep, but I then realized I had no clean clothes for work the next day. It couldn't be helped. I had to get the washing done. I felt like an idiot and a really terrible neighbor, since it was going to make a lot of noise with me going back and forth to the laundry room. When the laundry was done, I went to put out all of it on the clothesline to dry outside. It was a cold night, but there was enough wind to dry my clothes. As I was walking to the balcony door, a thought came creeping back into my mind. Is someone going to be out there, hiding, staring at you? For some reason, I imagined a woman soaked in blood. When I saw her face in my mind's eye, I shuddered. I knew that there would be no one out there though. How could there be? It was just my imagination though, right? I stepped out onto the balcony and forced myself to look through the gaps into the partition to put my mind at ease. There was no one there. Relieved, I went about my business, but then stopped in my tracks when I heard something. The sound of something scratching. It was very jaunty in the quiet of the night, especially since my imagination was running away with me. The scratching sound was loud. I wondered if it could perhaps be a hanger in the wind. I listened a little closer and realized it could not be a hanger scraping against something. It didn't sound metallic. It sounded like someone scratching their nails on a piece of wood. A horrible chilling wind had begun to blow, and despite the cold, I realized I was sweating. I hated that I scared myself. I told myself that it was just my neighbor, and they were just out on the balcony at the same time I was. I then looked for myself through one of the gaps in the partition, and I noticed that the lights were off. The strange scratching sound continued. I was standing there thinking, at the age of 30, I had finally experienced something paranormal. The thought profoundly frightened me. I knew that I would have to turn and pass the gap in the partition to return to my apartment. It was like some horrible test of courage. I turned to go back inside, and I knew the second I turned towards the gap, I would see something. Perhaps that woman. It sounds like I'm making something out of nothing, but there really was something strange out on the balcony at night. The vision of a blood-stained woman leapt to the forefront of my mind again. I hated my imagination. Why was the image so prominent? How long did I stand there frozen, unable to think of anything beside the image? 5, 10 minutes? I couldn't tell you. However long it was long enough for me to realize that the scratching sound had stopped. The balcony was now silent. I felt relieved and I blamed myself for overthinking. I was working myself up over nothing. Perhaps there was no ghost, no neighbor hiding. Maybe it was just an animal or a gust of wind. I had talked myself down from overreacting, And just as I was mentally telling myself off for watching too many horror films, I heard a large thud against the partition. It was horribly loud. My heart stopped for a moment. Someone was there. They had to be. My intuition was right. My eyes were then fixed the location of the sound and I couldn't move. I couldn't see anything through the gap. That is when I saw a jet black hand slowly wrap its hand around the outside of the balcony partition, and a head slowly crept around the corner and stared at me. I couldn't see through its hair in the darkness of the night, but it was there. It was horrifying to realize I wasn't alone, after all my suspicions. It was staring at me. It was so horrible. I burst into my room, pulled the door shut and locked it and closed the curtains. I left my apartment and stayed with a friend that night. I don't think I returned to my place for at least a week. Thank goodness for good friends, huh? He even went back to my place to retrieve some things. Even though it felt so real, I still try and tell myself it could have been some sort of hallucination. The horror of having your worst fears confirmed in the dead of night is something I wish upon no one. Or perhaps the hallucination theory is easier and more comforting to believe, or perhaps just makes the incident easier to forget. Days or weeks after that night, I forget which, I went to speak with my neighbor. His son was at university, and he told me that in the past he had complained to the building management. He said it sounded as if people were on his balcony every night. He thought it was someone trying to break in, but he couldn't be sure, as there was never anyone there. It was almost comforting to know that I wasn't alone in my experience. I thought my experience was bad, but the neighbor seemed to have had it worse. Whatever was going on was on their balcony after all. That's as far as my story went. All I can tell you is I left the apartment and haven't lived in an apartment with a balcony since, as these experiences haunt me to this day. When I was 8, and I'm a girl by the way, and my brother 9, we moved with my mum to a very small town after my parents split up. The new house was 2 stories with 3 bedrooms and a den. There was a large bedroom on the main floor with a full bathroom, and so my brother immediately claimed the big room on the main floor with the bathroom, and I was stuck in the purple nightmare. When we were moving, we noticed a lock on the door to my brother's room, but it was odd because it locked from the outside with a key. Eventually we found the key in the cellar. My mum just brushed it off. The room also only had one window, close to the ceiling, that was long but not wide and didn't open. So it let in light, but you couldn't really see outside unless you stood on something. The other 2 bedrooms both had a regular lock on the doors that locked from the inside. There was an attic at the top of the stairs that also had a lock on the outside, so we didn't think too much of it. We all went to bed that first night, and I don't remember anything too off myself, just new house strangeness. My brother next morning said the light in his bedroom was flickering, water running, flushing toilet, and he was left a bit freaked out. My mum checked the room out, and everything seemed fine in daylight. He decided to stick it out. We explored the house that day, found the key to the door, and odd leftovers from previous people in the cellar and attic. The attic was right beside my room, and I was a bit spooked by it, but I'm sure that was me just being 8. The next night after I went to bed, I woke up to my brother screaming at the top of his voice, "Mum, help me, please, help!" It was from downstairs. I got there first because my room was nearest, but my mum was right behind me. He was in his bed thrashing, and it looked like he was basically having a fit. When I got closer to his bed, he literally jumped out of it crying and staring at it. He said he felt something on his chest holding him down, and what felt like thumbs being pressed into his eyes, and a voice whispering, "Die out, die out, die out," in his ear. We couldn't see anything in the room, but my brother was adamant that he was not going to sleep there. My mum was trying to cheer him up and said that he could sleep in her room. My brother and I were halfway up the stairs, which were across from the room, and he asked her to please shut the door. I have never seen him so spooked. She laughed and said okay and went back to close the door, and even made a joke about being able to lock the door now, and did just that. As she started up the stairs towards us, we heard a loud knock on the door coming from the inside. Needless to say, my brother and I screamed bloody murder and ran for my mum's bedroom with her close behind. He moved into the small den the next day. He just couldn't sleep in there, so we turned it into a rec room and had our couch and TV in there instead. He had no issues in there. We never slept in that room, but anyone that came to stay with us said that they would be woken up by activity in the bathroom or catch glimpses of something, but never ever felt what my brother did, thankfully. We only lived there about 1.5 years. It's been 30 years now, and I've always wondered who or what was kept locked in that room, and why. This happened a long time ago. I'm guessing back in 2016. I couldn't have been older than 4 at the time, yet I vividly remember the fear I felt during this encounter. It was an early summer morning, and the sun was coming up, but few people were out. In fact, the streets were practically dead that morning. My mum decided to take my sister, a 1-year-old, seated in a stroller, and I to throw away some garbage at the garbage station. I might add that the garbage station is kind of secluded from nearby houses, bordering one of those deep, dark forests of eastern Sweden. Since I was only 4 when this happened, the memories from the incident have faded a lot. However, my mum remembers it all. She says that upon entering the garbage station, she immediately got an eerie feeling of being watched. I remember feeling it too. I felt creeped out, even though I didn't know why I was scared. I guess I could just sense my mum's fear. Walking along the secluded garbage station, my mum suddenly stopped and told me this: "Hold onto the stroller as hard as you can, and don't let go no matter what." That is my most vivid memory I have of this, and I don't think I'll ever forget those words. I'll at least never forget how they made me feel. It was as if my blood turned to ice. I just froze. My mum sounded stern, but even a toddler can sense when someone's scared shitless. My mum was definitely afraid of something. The rest is just a blur. I don't remember much, apart from the aforementioned. So I'll let the rest of the story be told from the perspective of my mother. This is the recollection of her experience, recalled to the best of my abilities but in my own words. Not far from where we were standing, a truck was parked with a man seated in the front. There was nothing unusual. A lot of truck drivers stopped to rest by the side of the road. But this man was staring. He wouldn't stop staring. He stared right at me, examining my body, with the determined gaze of a predator. Gluing the 3 of us in his sight, he truly seemed pleased by the fear he'd instilled in our faces. And his eyes, they were something else. Almost as if they didn't belong to a human, but rather a predator of the savannah. I felt like prey, stuck in the claws of a lion. I just couldn't move. That's when he smiled at me. I remember that smile, dead, cold, calculating eyes to go along with it, and the way he licked his lips, almost as if to say, "I could kill you if I wanted to." I believe this was the point in time, into the strange encounter, when my mum told me to hold onto the stroller, tightly, and not let go. My mum is a small woman, standing at 160 centimeters and weighing barely 45 kilos, and could easily have been overpowered by the overweight man in the truck. My mum later admitted she was afraid he would jump out and knock her out, possibly assaulting her, or even kidnapping me or my 1-year-old sister. We bolted out of there. We didn't throw away much garbage that morning. We just turned around and walked home as quickly as we could, as a mum can with a stroller and a 4-year-old and toddler. We never spoke about what happened that day up until very recently. This incident lingered somewhere in the back of my mind as that weird thing that happened when I was a child, and every time I walk past that garbage station I get a weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. As previously mentioned, this happened around 2006. Fast forward to 2008. The face of a 10-year-old girl called Engla was printed across the front page of every newspaper in sight. She had been abducted, sexually assaulted and murdered. And the perpetrator was an overweight truck driver by the name of Anders Elkland, now known as one of Sweden's most infamous killers. Anders Elkland was charged with the murder of Engla, alongside the rape and murder of a woman called Pernilla. He was also suspected of abducting another little girl who's still missing, making him a paedophile, a serial rapist, and serial killer. My mum says that when she saw Elkland's picture in the paper, especially when she saw those cold, familiar eyes, she knew he was the creepy man from the garbage station that early morning, all those years ago. Thinking how my mum, or my sister, or me, all of us could have been his victims, sends chills up my spine. Anders, even though you're behind bars, let's never meet again. Me and my male friends decided to go to Scotland for a camping trip with around 30 individuals, all guys. Considering we were travelling from Ireland to the Scottish Highlands and Lanark, this was a proper trip that no girl volunteered for. Too wet, too windy and all of that. So long story short, or as short as I can make it, we arrived and pitched our tents and set up for the first night. It took us longer than expected to get there, so we literally had to put our tents up in the dark while raining sideways. I noticed that my tent was missing a ground sheet, that square bit that goes under your tent. That was missing. I found it the next day. I yelled out, "Balls, I can't find my ground sheet." A close friend called Brian said to jump in the tent with him, which was already set up, which turned out to maybe be the best thing I've ever done, because I don't know if I could have experienced this on my own, and I'm so glad Brian was there to experience what happened with me. What I'm about to describe came straight out of the blue. We both laid side by side trying to sleep while hearing the howling wind and rain smashing into the tent. It was a proper mountain tent, so it was actually cozy. That's until I heard it. We both did. Everything went quiet. I mean everything. All the audio went mute. It was so strange. No wind, no rain, nothing. Then a little girl laughed loudly. For about 30 seconds. It was so creepy, it's hard to describe. Clear as day, right outside our tent. She actually sounded around 6 or 7 because at the time I had a younger sister roughly the same age. I'm in my 30s now, and I was around 18 or 19 when this happened. It was a disturbing laugh. I mean right at the door. A thin layer between us and it. Although I couldn't see her, I have never felt so scared. The feeling and sensation I was getting was so bad. I've never felt that uncomfortable before, ever. My entire body turned to ice and locked up in fear. It was a joyous laugh mixed with playful and sinister all at once. When she stopped laughing, it wasn't a fade-away laugh, as if she was running away. It just stopped in mid-laugh completely. Immediately both of us looked at each other, and I said, "Brian, did you just hear that?" "Yeah, a girl laughing," he replied. We did not think paranormal right away, and we both actually thought a girl was outside at 2 a.m. in the Highlands of Scotland lost, needing help. So we both panicked and bounced out, to see nothing but surrounded by rolling black hills. We got out of the tent in about 30 seconds and no one could have gotten down them highlands that quick. We both got this fear that stuck us together, and we jumped back into the tent. Don't know how long we lay there for dreading it would come back to laugh. To this day, Brian and I have never felt a fear like that before. We later discovered that those very hills were the hills where the innocent women and children were murdered during a Scottish civil war in the 1290s. At 12 years old, I was already riddled with PTSD and severe anxiety. Seeing a therapist twice a week did nothing to stop my extreme paranoia that someone was following me home from school, that someone may be watching me in my bedroom, and that someone may be trying to take me from my front yard. My mum raised 3 children by herself. My older brother was in high school, my younger brother in elementary, and I walked 3 blocks to the middle school just down the street from our house. Always the safe rather than sorry type of parent, my mum insisted that I walk with 2 other girls who lived on my street. As middle schoolers often do, we meandered on our way to school and cut through a yard and parking lots to spend most of the time gossiping. We would often split through a church parking lot if we were in a hurry. Usually, thrush with cars in the morning and afternoon from preschoolers in the back. It wasn't unusual to see the same cars every day on our school run, and again on our way back. The other girls thought nothing of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched on our trek home. In the winter months of my 7th grade year, we used our shortcut every day. The preschool was shut for renovations, so the icy parking lot was empty and perfect for throwing snowballs or sliding on patches of ice. Only a few cars regularly lingered in the front of the building, except one white pickup truck that was parked in the back. Every time I saw it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Every morning and afternoon, a man would be sitting in the driver's seat of the truck, looking out the window watching us walk. I told my mother the first time I saw him, knowing I was prone to panic. She brushed it off and told me he must work at the church. The second time I brought it up, she gave me a pink canister of pepper spray and told me to use it first and apologize later. I gripped it in my cold hand every day after that when we passed the man in his truck. I described him to my mother in detail. A few weeks after we saw the truck for this first time, we crossed the lot after school and found it empty. I breathed the fresh breath, putting my pepper spray in my bag and kicking up powdery snow out of relief. That joy died when I turned down my street and saw the truck parked in a driveway 5 houses down from mine. I sprinted home, locked the door behind me, and counted the minutes until my mother would come home from work. When she finally did, I berated her with my questions. Who was the man? Did he live there? What did she know? But my mum's answers were short and non-descriptive. As a single mother, she didn't mingle much with the neighbors and seldom had time to inquire about who lived where. She did know that the couple who owned the house where the pickup sat had a deranged son, who had been sent to a mental hospital after an incident when he was 14. I was filled with fear. I closed the curtains to my window before the sun had even set that night, and before I went to bed locked every window and door in the house. I was convinced that this insane man who watched me walk to school was going to kill me. When I finally did fall asleep that night, I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of our doorbell being pressed repeatedly, almost as if someone were leaning on it. I looked across the hall and my mother was standing in her doorway, face white as a sheet. I scampered across the hall and held my little brother tightly as my mum went to the door. Without opening it, she shouted, "Who are you? What do you want?" There was no reply, only the sound of the doorbell persisting. Through the peephole, she saw the man who drove the truck parked 5 houses down. She shouted that she was calling the police. As she dialed 911 on her phone, the ringing stopped and was shortly replaced by banging, as if the man was trying to break down the door. Red and blue lights flooded our street, and the man ran off through the street. The police didn't chase him. Instead, parking in our driveway, they asked my mother if she had told him to go away. Panicked and crying, she told them she hadn't, and they said there was nothing they could do. She asked to file a restraining order, but they said there was no way to know for sure it was the man down the street. I told them the license number of the truck that was parked in the church's parking lot, and that the man who drives it was the same man my mum saw ringing our bell. The police wrote it down but didn't seem interested, and after about 20 minutes of asking questions, they left and advised we locked our doors. My mother Googled the last names of the couple down the street and found out that their son had been discharged at the same time that the truck started showing up in the parking lot. He had been arrested for raping two 12-year-old girls when he was 14, and it was determined that he suffered from a mental disability. He was sentenced to serve 30 years in a mental hospital, and then to be put on parole. We moved. To this day, I'm still convinced that he was trying to kidnap me that night. Let's not meet again. Around 2 weeks ago, I was on my front doorstep, about to bun a zit, and I started hearing some spooky noises coming from just behind my back garden. I thought it would just be a cat or something, so I turned on my phone torch to see what it was. I wish I hadn't looked, and I just went inside because, well, what I saw was a bit scatty. I scanned the back of my garden with the torch, and seemingly out of nowhere did I spot two red eyes. I held the light on the eyes because I thought it was me just being dumb, and then whatever it was blinked. I moved the light a little bit to see the glare on the eyes shift. These aren't normal animal eyes that were a bit red because of the dark. They were completely red with no pupil. I started trying to make noises to scare whatever it was off, but it didn't move and just stayed dead still, and then after a minute, I saw it turn around and vanish into the woods. The whole time I couldn't see its face nor body, it was too dark. I have no idea what it was, but it was very, very unnatural. During the next few days, obviously after seeing what I did, I was quite hesitant to leave my house at night. But it was really warm in the south of England, so I leave my windows open at night. It often sounds like there's something directly outside my window, or I'll hear my gate open and close. But if it was a person cutting through, they would have had to have opened both gates, but I only ever hear the one, and nothing's ever gone missing either, which I would expect if someone were trespassing. By the end of the week, I'd just chalk it up to some animal that maybe aren't supposed to get around here, so I moved on and forget about it. Yesterday evening, because of COVID, I haven't really been able to see my girlfriend that much. So, we were having a fire in my garden. We kept hearing weird noises, but again just assumed it was an animal, as I'd forgotten about the encounter with the red eyes at this point. When the fire had died down and we were going to go to bed, I came back down the stairs to have a cigarette on my back doorstep, and about halfway through the cigarette I heard that same noise that I heard on the first night that I saw the eyes. I instantly started praying out loud and turned on my torch again, and there they were. This time I didn't see them blink once, and I was looking at it for nearly 2 minutes. It had also moved and wasn't in the same place where I saw it the previous time. It was behind my neighbor's garden, yet still looking directly at me. Something really scary dawned upon me at that moment. Where it was standing, there's a massive dip just behind the fence, and it seemed to be peeking at me from it. I really started to panic at this point, so I decided I was going to throw something at it to see if it moved or if it's scared of me. About 10 seconds later, the thing just disappeared into the woods again. I went inside but didn't lock the door because I was going to get a drink and gonna close it after. The door handle started to go down like someone was trying to open it, so I grabbed the closest knife and swung the door open. But there wasn't anything there. I'm convinced that this isn't an animal, because in England we don't have really big animals, and the animals we do have greeny yellowy eyes when light reflects from them. If anyone can assist me with an explanation of what this could possibly be, I'd be incredibly grateful. Ever since I was younger, I've heard people call my name, Whether it be somewhere rural or in my home, it's constantly happened, and it's starting to freak me out. Let me give you a bit of context. I am a 17-year-old female. I live in Florida and have always been aware of my Native American culture, even though I'm not of that heritage myself. This all started when I was very young. The first instance of this happening was when I was living with my grandmother. Her and I were very close. I was wide awake in bed, unable to sleep with her to my right. There's no doubt in my mind that she was deeply asleep, only a few inches from me. Every television in the house was off, and the only other person in the house was my grandfather asleep in his room. Then very clearly and loudly I heard my grandmother call me from the kitchen, almost how you'd call someone for dinner. I know it's common to hear your name being called mistakenly, but I did more research on this as a teen, and apparently when you hear your name being called this loud, you're supposed to reject it. Not knowing this, I just huddled closer to my grandmother and kept my eyes locked on the open door. The second instance was around 13 or 14 when my father took me on a trip to Las Vegas. We visited some part of the Grand Canyon, and while my family were waiting in line for a skywalk bridge, we paid for a tour. I wandered around the edge a good distance away from my family and decided to yell my name into the canyon to hear my echo. When it came back to me, it sounded distorted, almost like my grandmother had yelled my name back. It might have not been my grandmother, but it was very similar. Nonetheless, just the fact that it was distorted was enough to scare me a little. I don't put much weight into this experience, as it could have just been my own voice coming back weirdly. The next event happened when I was 13. It was the most terrifying one I've ever had. This is the closest I've ever been to whatever this thing is, and proves my point that it's mimicking people. I was on a vacation with my family in Key West, and had rented a home. I invited my best friend, called Ash, to stay with us. On the third day, we decided to skip out on a boating trip and mooch off the house owner's Netflix all day. At about the 5th episode of whatever we were watching, we decided on a snack refill and bathroom break. We paused the television and make our way to the kitchen. I believe that Ash had followed me into the kitchen and leaned on the island while I prepared some chips with my back turned to her. I held a full-on conversation with whatever the thing was and even looked back at her on the phone. I fully had no doubt in my mind I was talking and looking at Ash on her phone. She even held it in this specific way that Ash does. I turned my back for a split second to pick up the bowls and suggested we head back to the couch, when I see Ash, or the real Ash anyway, walk out the bathroom, which was a solid 30 feet away. My body immediately went cold, and the first thing I asked her was how she got to the bathroom in and out without me hearing. She gave me the strangest look and told me she's been in there the whole time since we got up. This is where I start freaking out and insist that I had just been talking to her and even physically saw her. She joked about doppelgangers and how she was going to die. I quickly suggested we get out of the house and walk around the neighborhood. She then informed me she had gotten her period while she was in the bathroom, at the same time I was talking to whatever it was. We walked around until my mum called me that she was back in the house. We're still best friends to this day and have been for 11 years, and I've asked her about it, and she said she didn't even hear me speaking with anyone at all. Now at this point you might think I'm crazy, but for this next one I have witnesses. I was on a vacation near the Great Smoky Mountains, just a little west in Surreyville, Tennessee. We had our previous reservations cancelled, so we took this little rundown cabin owned by a local woman. Now we got there late at night, and during the moment we all stepped out the car, the first thing we heard was a man's voice, "Hey neighbors," coming from one of the cabins to our left, that was higher up on the mountain than we were. We couldn't see the cabin really, just a road that led further up, and we all assumed he could see us, but we not him. Probably some guy on his balcony, we thought. My friendly stepdad yelled, "Hey," and waved up towards the direction the sound came from. It wouldn't have been weird if this didn't happen every time we stepped out the cabin or car. My family completely wrote it off as some type of hospitality we were not used to in Miami. Retelling it, my brother and my friends agreed it was weird. I did hear constant footsteps around the cabin at night and some outside my window. But I didn't give it much thought since wildlife is a thing in the woods. Just something I thought I should mention. The thing that really propelled me into researching what the hell was happening to me was when I was having a photo shoot in the woods behind the cabin, and both my brother, sister, and I heard something calling my name deeper in the woods. Since I was with my younger siblings, I went into a full big sister protection mode and almost threw them back down the little slope we had to climb to get to the woods. We were all crapping ourselves from how clear it was and how we all pinpointed it was coming from the deeper woods and nowhere near the cabin. This was during the day, and we were all so thrown by this that we stayed in for the rest of the trip. We all agreed it was a woman's voice, and the first thing I asked my mum when we went outside was, "Did you call me?" She had been lounging in her room with my stepdad all day, trusting that I could take care of the younger ones just outside the cabin. She saw how freaked out the kids were, and we didn't really go outside at night for the rest of our trip. I think I reacted to this quite badly, because I had kids to take care of and I can tell that they were terrified out there. The voice sounded like someone was looking for me or calling me back somewhere. With no knowledge of what this could have been, I finally decided to look into things when I turned 17. I had no previous knowledge of Wendigos or skinwalkers or anything cryptic, only ghost investigation shows. I'm desperate for answers, because at this point I'm constantly thinking about it and driving myself into rabbit holes of information, myths, and legends. I studied abroad in Oxfordshire, England in 2012 and lived in an abbey that was built in 1215. On this day it was a beautiful sunny day, and for some reason I was the only one in the abbey. It was a small group of us studying there at the time, perhaps only 40 to 45 altogether. I was in the library, sitting on a couch located under a window that was across the room from a wall with a fireplace. The door into the library was on the left of the fireplace. I was reading a book for class when suddenly, over the top of my book, in my peripheral, I saw a man walking into the room with me. He walked by the fireplace and continued into the room. He was a tall man, and what I noticed immediately was that he was wearing a full suit. My first thought was that it was very early, and I wondered who the heck is wearing a suit right now. I looked up from my book to acknowledge him, and there was no one there. I was completely alone in the room. I got goosebumps, and my heart beat harder in my chest, but I wasn't terrified. I just kind of went, okay, and carried on reading my book. I had almost forgotten about the incident until a few nights later a friend of mine told me the receptionist had been telling her ghost stories about the abbey. One of the stories that had been shared was that when it was quiet in the library, students reported seeing a butler walking around. A butler. I flushed bright red when she told me this and immediately thought of the man in the suit. I went back into the library again a few more times on my own while I studied there, but never saw him again.
Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you so much for listening and joining me tonight as the year wraps up to an end. Did you guys hear all of these stories before, or were some of them new to you? I would seriously love to let me know, so please be sure to do so. I just want to say thank you everyone for watching. It really does mean a lot, and sticking with me throughout this year. I hope that you guys keep sticking around and that we're together for more horror stories as the years follow. I also would like to give you a little teaser for Christmas Day video, the 25th. Now, I know on Saturdays I will, generally speaking, always have a comp, but it is 10 original Christmas stories with a good friend of mine, and I really hope you like the video. I'm going to give you a fair warning though. The first story is It's like one of the best stories I've read all year. For real. It is a Christmas present to you all, and it is fantastic. You do not want to miss this Christmas video, and you especially want to listen to this whole really long first story the whole way through. It is so good. It is one of the crown jewels of this year's selection of stories. So please check it out. Don't miss it, even if you listen a few days later. I really hope you like it. Alright then guys, I'm going to wrap things up here. Thank you all so much for your support, for tuning in, and just stay awesome. And a huge thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. I'll see you in the next one on Christmas.